This year, a handful of high-profile legal issues dominated the headlines, including former U.S. Navy SEAL Chris Kyle's murder trial and Sergeant Bo Bergdahl's court appearance this week. So here to highlight some of the cases that captivated us in 2015 are criminal defense attorneys Jay Apt and Rebecca Nitkin. Thank you guys both for joining us. We have a slew of cases to get to. At one point or another, all of these cases captivated us and took up the headlines. I want to start, and I want to get you, Rebecca, to start us with March 14th. We heard real estate heir Robert Durst arrested on a murder warrant for the killing of Susan Berman 15 years ago. Right. Was this surprising to you?
It's surprising that it took so long, and you want to know about what we have learned. Do not do a documentary series on television when you possibly are a suspect in 3 murders. Not 1, not 2, but 3. 3 dead bodies, 3 decades, 3 murders, and he already stood trial for murder once, admitted that he killed his neighbor, and chopped the neighbor up, but he was acquitted on self-defense.
Jay, what surprised you about this?
It's incredible. She's right. If the rule number 1 of criminal defense is don't talk, can't talk. And he goes and does this documentary out of ego, maybe out of mental illness. But the fascinating thing about the documentary is at the end, they compare the 2 letters. One is the anonymous letter written by the murderer. The other is a letter he wrote 15 years earlier to Susan Berman. And they're both misspelling the same word in block letters, Beverly Hills. And then he leaves his mic on, and he goes to the bathroom, and the mic's still hot, and he's talking to himself, and he says, "Of course, I killed them all."
Right.
I mean, it's just
we all remember that.
You can't make that up. And you know, he's used his billions of dollars and his money, family's money, to avoid the murder rap in Texas. There's a lot of evidence suggesting he killed his first wife, Kathy, early on 3 decades ago. Things like. Yes. She was wearing her jewelry that night, and her jewelry was found then at the home afterwards. So this guy's got a long time coming. They're gonna,
okay. And to move on, February 24th, Ray Routh charged with killing former U.S. Navy SEAL Chris Kyle. Very emotional. What did we learn from that, Rebecca?
Well, you have the entire country enamored with Chris Kyle. He is a real live American hero, and then he wrote a book, so even more people are watching him, and he and his friend Littlefield are taking care of a vet, and the vet kills him, and then the movie comes out before the trial. What did we learn? That if you are significantly mentally ill in Texas, you're going to be found guilty instead of insane or not criminally responsible, because their statute only says that you have to determine right from wrong, not that you have to confine your behavior to what society expects. So he is guilty, and that is the end of that.
Right. And Jay, obviously, Ray Routh sentenced to life in prison.
Yeah, you know, Rebecca's right. Less than 5% of all insanity defenses nationwide are effective and ultimately get a not guilty by reason of insanity. It's not a very good defense to try and raise, but it's a Hail Mary when you have really nothing else. This gentleman had been institutionalized a couple times before for threatening to kill himself and others. He has been fairly violent since he's been in custody. He's gotten in a lot of fights in the jail, had been tasered, put in solitary confinement. So there's a long history here of this man's mental health issues, but it's not enough because the standard is very high in this country in order to prove insanity.
Right. Another case that certainly captivated the nation, all facets of it. On April 8th, the jury finds Dzhokhar Tsarnaev guilty of all 30 charges against him for the Boston Marathon bombing. Jay, surprised by this ruling?
You know, no. I mean, this is a horrible terroristic act. I know one of the attorneys who represented Tsarnaev personally. He had the best attorneys in the country. These are phenomenally trained, brilliant lawyers, Judy Clark and Bill Fick. And, you know, what's interesting about the case is that the FBI used an exception to the Miranda requirement in order to question him, and still that information came in to the trial. I think that's a bad ruling legally. I don't think we should have an exception to Miranda, even in issues of national security. I'm not saying the FBI shouldn't be able to question someone without Mirandizing them, just that they shouldn't use those statements in court afterwards. But I'm not surprised by the verdict.
Rebecca?
I think that the exception really wasn't going to be a big significant difference in this case. The problem was that what surprised many is that the defense basically admitted to everything and used the trial, the 2 weeks of the trial, to soften the blow for the defendant, and basically put on 4 witnesses and said the brother Tamerlan did it, the brother Tamerlan did it. He's the one who downloaded all the jihad material, bought the equipment, built the bombs, etc. But they had to overcome 92 witnesses with the most brutal testimony that any normal jurors, they're not prepared to listen to war-torn testimony and look at that unbelievable destruction, body parts flying off, and the blood and the destruction. It was too much for anybody. 92 anecdotes. There was no way this was going to come out any other way.
Okay, so quickly, we only have time for one more case. I want to talk about something that's obviously very recently in the headlines: mistrial for the Baltimore officer William Porter, the first officer charged in the death of Freddie Gray. Surprised by this? Rebecca, I'll start with you, and Jay, you can wrap it up.
Well, I wasn't surprised. I initially said I thought they were charged too early. It was very good that this case stayed in Baltimore. Porter was born in Baltimore a few months earlier than the defendant. They crossed paths. He lives there. He works there. He was tried by jurors of his peers that, you know, they listened. They spent 3 days. They determined that it was a mistrial. But the most important part about this is what's going to happen with the prosecution, because they needed his testimony against Goodson. And the second part I think that's important is that he was being tried for what he did not do rather than what he did do. And the jurors had a hard time saying a reasonable person in his shoes at the 4th stop might have done the same thing. So I wasn't surprised.
Okay, Jay, we only have about 10 seconds. Do you have the final word?
You know, I'm not surprised, because the problem here is Marilyn Mosby, a very inexperienced prosecutor. She puts up the weakest case first. She's got a lot of cases to try. Put up your strongest case first, or use a guy like Porter and flip him. Get him to plea in exchange for testifying against Goodson. That would have been the correct strategy, and she botched it.
Yeah, maybe it would have played out differently. Jay Apt, thank you so much. Rebecca Nitkin, I appreciate you both for being here. Very interesting year.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
You as well.